Hey y'all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, manager at Kittelson and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in Evanston. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGO member. Engaging local government leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. And now you can follow GovLove on LinkedIn, so you'll never miss an episode and you can get to know other GovLove listeners. So give our page a follow there. Just go ahead and search GovLove Podcast on that platform. So now let me introduce today's guest. Lara Biggs is the Bureau Chief for Capital Planning and also the City Engineer for the City of Evanston, Illinois, a position she's been in since 2015. Prior to that, she served as the Superintendent for Construction and Field Services for the city's Utilities Department for 8 years, and she also served as a project manager and project engineer for several private engineering firms at the beginning of her career. So with that, Lara, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So we have a tradition on the podcast to start with a lightning round to let our guests get to know you a little bit. So my first question for you, what was the first concert that you went to?
Well, I'm going to be dating myself here, but I went to see Richard Marx at Assembly Hall at University of Illinois when I was in college.
Oh, nice. Is that, are they still in your rotation as a as a band you listen to, or?
Occasionally, but I've moved on a little bit from just 80s music.
Fair enough. Awesome. All right, then my next lightning round question for you: cake or pie?
Oh, nothing beats chocolate cake.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. A recent guest who will remain nameless came on to make a strong case for pie, but I'm with you. I disagree. I think case with that. Yeah. All right. Then my next linear question for you: what's the last thing, movie, TV show that you watched?
Well, last night I watched The Commuter with Liam Neeson. So my husband and I have been watching, oddly, a lot of Liam Neeson movies lately, which is Taken, A Walk Among the Tombstones, Ice Road. And we're discovering that although he hasn't really been in the rotation, he is actually pretty solid artist when he's in movies. Oh. And also it's great how no matter how many times he gets shot or beaten up or stabbed or knocked unconscious, he comes around and beats the stuffing out of whoever it is that is the enemy or the bad guy. So it's really encouraging.
Yeah, I love that. Prevailing over adversity, right?
Yes, very tough.
Well, that's awesome. All right, then my last lightning round question for you. Where do you go for inspiration?
That's really interesting because I think we get most of our inspiration, honestly, just from our daily lives. So for me, that's my family, kids, community that I grew up in. I actually moved to Evanston about 25 years ago. And so my kids were raised here and I used the park and recs programs. They went to the Evanston schools. And then after they are largely grown up, I found myself in the position of really looking at our infrastructure and seeing how it's used. And I feel like it's given me a pretty good perspective on what some of the challenges are. In my personal life also, though, I have to say there was, I'm a big fan actually of Walt Disney. Mm-hmm. I think the man really is amazing how he's touched the culture and the environment. But they did a movie called Meet the Robinsons, which was a good movie, but wasn't really one of their top sellers. And there's a quote from Walt Disney at the end that talks about just keep moving forward. So the movie is about how sometimes you'll fail or you don't get things right. And that's when you just keep moving forward. And I love that feeling like that you could fail 17 times or 100 times, but it's not really so much as failing as just, okay, we've learned something, let's adjust, and we'll keep moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's a great saying. That's well said. All right. And then I'm always curious to know folks' path to local government. So you started to touch on it a little bit there, but what was your path to working for the City of Evanston and the position you're in today?
It's been convoluted, as probably most people find their careers being. I've always been kind of an environmentalist. So that really led me in college to falling into environmental engineering, which is a type of civil engineering. And so after I graduated, I did work doing large wastewater treatment plant design and water treatment plant design as a consultant.
Yeah.
From there, I one day got a job working for a private firm, Earth Tech, as a contract employee managing design projects for Department of Water Management in Chicago. And honestly, it's like my eyes were opened. It just felt so interesting and amazing looking at things from the owner's point of view, but also navigating those types of challenges. Essentially, I really love being a bureaucrat. I
Yeah.
love trying to figure out how to build that coalition and get everybody on board with the project. And not just by running over them or ignoring them, but figuring out how to incorporate what they need so that the project becomes something that they're interested in doing also and supporting. And then eventually the position at Evanston opened up to manage the capital program at the water plant. And so from there, I started in Evanston and eventually worked my way into being city engineer.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah. And it's interesting. You got some of that, like, you called it the owner's perspective, but the view of like the local government from that, working on the private side. Was there like a particular project or, I don't know, experience you had that you're like, oh man, was that aha moment of like opening your eyes to that kind of local government work?
There were so many examples working in Chicago. I mean, it is a really interesting place and actually pretty different from Evanston in the daily work-life balance and what you need to do to get projects done. But the mayor's office had a directive that was given to the Department of Water Management that they needed to put a green roof on Jardine water filtration plant, and they had 12 months to do it, which is really impossible. That was never going to happen.
Yeah.
But I was surprised how a lot of people that I talked to, not necessarily working for Chicago, but just in engineering, were like, oh, Chicago is so bureaucratic. That's going to be really difficult. And I just felt like, well, I don't know how we're going to do this, but we can start. You know, I prioritized it and really tried to, talk to everybody, make sure I understood what they needed, and then hired a consultant. We got the design going. It was a really interesting process. And unfortunately, I actually left Chicago before it was done. And we didn't meet the 12-month deadline. I mean, that's just an engineering fact. It takes a while to put together a big project like that. But we were able to make a lot of progress and get it to purchasing within that 12 months. And I credit the consultants I worked with, which were from a variety of companies, but also just the staff working at Department of Water Management, and how when they see that there's a serious proposal and it's something that can be done, they really overcome a lot of challenges to get it going. I mean, they are a group of people that really can focus. So I really enjoyed working there, but City of Evanston was where I was living.
Yeah.
And my commute reduced significantly. So it worked out.
Well, that's a perfect transition. So maybe, before we get into some of the nitty gritty of doing pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, can you give us a sense of your team's work within the city, and maybe also for folks that don't know about Evanston or haven't been to the area, like just a sense of, what they would find if they visited Evanston, or kind of some of the, the things they ought to know about the community.
Sure. Evanston is the first suburb north of the city of Chicago along the lakefront. And as such, it's actually really quite an urban suburb, but it has, it's very progressive. It focuses a lot on social issues and worrying about affordable housing and other very challenging problems that really work towards the quality of life issues. But on the infrastructure side, they focus a lot on things that make the infrastructure really usable by everybody. So they want, there's a big push by the community to preserve the environment, looking at making sure we have a really robust urban forest, that trees are valued and really taken care of as we do our infrastructure projects and in the community. We also have the lakefront. So there's a push that we're seeing now towards starting to naturalize our lakefront a little bit
Mm.
and really try to invest in the value as well as making the lakefront accessible to everyone, including ADA accessibility. We, in my group, we have consolidated all of the engineering, the architecture, the landscape architect, and the technical people that support those disciplines into one group. So our Bureau of Capital Planning works on all the city's infrastructure, including the water plant, which serves many communities, about 400,000 people in the northern
Oh, wow.
suburbs right now. We also have parks, our city facilities, our water main, sewer, streets, sidewalks. So it's actually a really great group to work in, filled with a lot of disciplines. And so we're able to really troubleshoot our projects in a way that we're trying to consider everything. When we do a water main project, we're looking at things like tree improvements.
Yeah.
When we do sidewalks, we want to make sure we're addressing all of the other infrastructure needs as well. And it helps us coordinate our projects a little bit better when they're adjacent to each other, or pick up one kind of thing like fixing sidewalks when we're doing a park that
Yeah.
runs next to the sidewalk, so that we can kind of look at things more holistically.
Yeah. No, I was going to say that, like, that probably does make that a lot easier to have a consolidated group where you can do both water main replacements and a street maintenance project together, or in succession, rather than having to coordinate between multiple departments to make that happen.
One thing about the city is that with its focus on being innovative and tackling really difficult problems, it tends to attract staff
Mm.
that really enjoy working on these kinds of challenges and looking at change.
Yeah.
And for that, I feel really grateful, because it is much more interesting working in a community where people recognize that nothing's perfect and
Yeah.
we need a process of continuous improvement. So we're always trying to do things a little bit better than we did them last year.
Very cool. Very cool. And so, out of curiosity, is your group do both like project design and project management, or are you mostly project management of capital projects?
We do both. We actually have in transportation a number of professionals that really focus on water main and street resurfacing design projects. They do alley design in-house,
Oh, wow.
and so sidewalk improvements, crosswalks, a lot of traffic calming issues. We do those design projects in-house. But when we get to the really big streetscape projects, we do contract that out,
Mhm.
just because when you're working with federal and state funds, you're working with a lot of public engagement. Those are resources that start to stretch us really thin.
Yeah.
And then in our other areas, again, it's sort of a mix of in-house design for simple projects. For more complex projects, we work with consulting firms and to really come up with sort of that best management practice of how we want to change.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Well, that makes for exciting variety of work for your staff too. That they get to do some design if they want, and also get to work with consultants on those bigger ones. Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, many of them do a combination. And, being able to do that design, I think, makes people better project managers,
Mm.
and definitely makes it so that we're in construction and we're overseeing the contractor, when challenges arise, often they're able to troubleshoot those things very quickly and get
Yeah.
to good solutions.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, you've already kind of previewed some of the stuff I wanted to spend most of our time talking about today. But, there was a recent article, I think it was in Next City, holding up Evanston as a model for making improvement in bicycle and pedestrian safety. And so, I wanted to talk to you about kind of the work that y'all have done around that. So maybe at a high level, where does that come from? Like, is there a plan that you guys are working towards around bike and pedestrian infrastructure, or how do you guys kind of approach that maybe holistically as both your group and the city as a whole?
Yes, well, we had a bike plan, multimodal transportation plan, that was developed in the early 2000s and updated sort of 2009. There was a more formal multimodal transportation plan developed. We did a bike plan update in 2019. So we have a series of city council adopted plans where we go back and revisit. And that's provided us with a network of streets that we would like to see have more bicycle and pedestrian safety improvements on them that act as that core network. Now, there's a lot of gaps in the network and how different infrastructure has been installed. Just because something's marked as a bike route doesn't mean that we've actually done anything to improve the street for biking. It just means that it was a logical choice for where to put a bike route. And most of those types of projects we do involve really looking at the whole streetscape. And so they're big projects that require federal funds or state funds in order to implement. So it's a slow process, but one that we're sort of always working towards to fill in those gaps in our network and get to an overall better system.
Yeah. So you have this kind of big general plan, and then as new projects or new things come up, you work to fit that into that general guidance. Is that fair?
Yes. And, as time goes on, obviously things are different in some parts of town than they were in 2002.
Yeah.
So we do see challenges arise that help us sort of intelligently adjust the plan or make sure that this one issue rises to the top of the priorities. So maybe there are 10 things on the plan we could choose to do next, but it's pretty clear that two of them are our biggest challenges where we're seeing accidents, we're getting a lot of complaints. So that's the sort of thing that informs us as to how we move next is what's happening lately.
Yeah. So what is I had that on my list to ask you about. What are some of the data points that you're looking at when you have those 10 projects, but you have to prioritize them for which ones you're going to do in the coming year? So what is maybe the data you're looking at, and what are the goals that you're trying to accomplish through some of these projects?
Well, we look at first and foremost things like accident data are really important for highlighting where you have challenges. Now, we are really fortunate in Evanston. We definitely have traffic accidents, and I wish we didn't have any traffic accidents. And some of those accidents involve bicycles and pedestrians who are obviously vulnerable, and that doesn't make anybody happy. Those are things we want to address. But we are fortunate in that we don't have that many fatal accidents. There's relatively few. So you really have to sift not only the accident data, but also where are you seeing complaints, where people are putting in comments into our 311 system that there's a challenge where their kids crossing the street, or you hear from business owners that there's a lot of difficulty with people accessing their businesses because parking or traffic or a variety of issues. So our council members end up being really good resources in forwarding that type of information, although they are not usually directing where we should do the work, more that they're really collating all of the information that's coming up from their constituents and sending it to us.
Yeah. So to give you that sense of like, hey, where are the issues in the network that we need to address as we're thinking about capital projects? Yeah.
Yes. And then before we do anything, we do like to bounce the concept off of the council members of the wards that are affected. And that's just because they are really kind of the boots on the ground people that really see what the community is really looking for in terms of safety and where they think the community is going to have a challenge with the proposal. So they work with us frequently at the front end as our litmus test that we're not doing something crazy, but we're doing something that's really going to be needed by the community.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there maybe, I don't know if there's an example project or if you just have a general approach that you do for all projects of that you can think of where that's an example of what you're talking about, of going through deciding what needs to be done. I don't know if it's like a segment of street that you're going to resurface and so, hey, let's think about redesigning, or if it's hey, we're going to look at this whole, street or avenue from here to here. But I don't know, can you maybe walk through maybe an example or how you guys approach that to think about prioritizing bike and pedestrian safety while also meeting the needs of the community?
Yeah, so we have a project coming up in construction this year on our Main Street Business District. It's on Main Street near Chicago Avenue. And that is a project that's been in the works on and off for at least 8 years.
Oh, wow.
Uh, it's definitely a place where the sidewalks and other infrastructure really deteriorated. It gives the business district really sort of a rundown appearance, despite the best efforts of the business owners who are really trying to run really vibrant and interesting businesses in this area. And so as we started looking at what are we going to be doing in that area, it actually touches 3 different wards. Our council members are elected by wards, so it's a geographic area. So we met with each of the council members and said, hey, we have this challenge. It's an interesting project because although there are bicycles in the area, a lot of the challenges are actually pedestrian related. So the street's not overly wide. So we have to be very careful about finding all the extra space we need for everybody. But, we asked the council members, what do you think? Like, if we do work here, how important is this parking to the businesses? Is this something that's where we find our space, or is it somewhere else? How much difficulty are you seeing with bicycles? Are you getting a lot of complaints from pedestrians that they're had near misses with cars or that they feel like something needs to change? So we then float a proposal. Hey, in this section, we're not actually going to impact parking very much. That means that we have limited opportunity really to put in new bike lanes, but we want to focus on things like crosswalks and sidewalks. Does that seem like a reasonable approach? And if the council members are like, yes, based on what I know about the businesses and the residents in the area, I think you're addressing the real challenges by doing that. Or maybe they come back and they say, no, in fact, in this particular case, we had planned to remove a certain amount of parking, and one of the council members was really concerned about that. So we looked at some adjacent parking lot areas and saw how we could incorporate those in the project and make changes. So we sort of expanded out the project a little bit to make some changes that would allow us to maintain a similar number of parking spaces to support the local businesses. And so that's sort of step one. And then it goes into applying for funding, getting into what is considered the phase 1 planning phase. Since we wanted to use state or federal funding, we made a leap that we would get some, and we did a very robust phase 1 planning. So then we're talking to, we set up a stakeholder advisory group, which includes local business leaders, a couple of residents from the surrounding neighborhood, but also people from some of our other city departments. Our community development has a planning position that focuses on transportation, looking at our economic development. And this particular area, there was a special service area for the local business district. So they have an executive director. So in addition to a couple of business owners, we also had the executive director on it, and we had manager that supports economic development for the city of Evanston. And then we also had 2 council members on it. So we pull together this group, we get our consultant on board, and the consultant starts putting out very preliminary plans, talking about what the public engagement looks like, and bounces it off that group, figuring that if we can get the stakeholders to give us feedback on what they think will work or not work, we have already gotten some really critical insight into what's important to that neighborhood and what is going to fly. We went through several public engagements. In those, we sort of flyer everybody in the neighborhood or email postcards to everybody to make sure, whether they're a resident or a business, they're aware that the public engagement is going to happen. We we start with just really big ideas, like this is the challenge we're starting to address, but here are some concerns. What do you think are the most important things for us to tackle? And then we start presenting concepts in subsequent meetings to really try to get everybody to give us feedback as to what's going to really work the best. And then hopefully by the time we're done, and with the concept, we've got something that's really been battle tested, that we reach out to our Go Evanston group, which deals with active transportation issues. Some of our environmental people got involved, and we really welcome that, because the time when we want to discuss what's going to work or not work is when it's all just drawings on a piece of foam board or up on a PowerPoint. We do not want to be having that conversation in the middle of construction.
Yeah, exactly.
So the time to test everything is when we're in planning. So we really try to reach out to everyone and make sure that everybody feels like they had their chance. And we also view ourselves as sort of the mediators. We're not trying to tell you how it's going to be. We want the environmentalists to talk to the business owners who are talking to the people who want bike lanes, so that they can hear what everybody has to say and understand why sometimes you don't get everything you want, but maybe you just get enough to make it a good project.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. So you're a convener in that way. You're bringing together all these voices that want to have a say in the project, and kind of, like you said, mediating between all of those to find a solution that works for as many people as possible. That's a really cool approach.
It is really time intensive.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine.
Resources, and I will say it takes a lot of funding to do it that way. Working with the Illinois Department of Transportation for when we're going to use federal or state funds, they're involved in improving things. They require a process like this, but we sometimes do kind of a shortened version of this process when we don't have state or federal funds involved. And our city council has always been really supportive of understanding that it does take resources, but sometimes that's what you need to do when you have these projects that are going to affect really large changes in how a street looks.
Yeah, exactly. Especially on an area like a main street where there's going to be a lot of attention and a lot of traffic on there, both foot and bike and vehicle.
Yes.
Very cool. So I'm curious, is there ever tension between when you are bringing these folks together or having this, it seems like almost a community driven, stakeholder driven process, and maybe what, a traffic engineer would say is the best approach to creating throughput on a street? Like, is there any of that kind of tension between, hey, this is what the community is looking for, and these are the problems we're trying to solve, versus maybe what the best way to optimize for traffic flow would be?
There is. And I have to say that most of that on projects that involve active transportation, it comes down to parking quite a lot of the time. Sometimes other things, but frequently parking. And the answer to that is not always that easy. So we do have projects that go in with reductions in parking, and frequently the people that would utilize that parking or immediately next to it do get really upset about it. So we do try to work with them to figure out if there are other solutions. Sometimes it can be looking at the parking on the adjacent streets to see if there are changes that can be made there. And sometimes there are just people that are not happy, and we often rely on council members at that point to really try to help us determine what is the most workable solution.
Yeah.
I will say that most of the time, although we may end up with the occasional person that is not happy with the design or who feels like something is just not appropriate, we do get to a place where people can live with the design, and most people are really happy about it. But a lot of that involves people talking to each other and really understanding, seeing the different iterations, and that each iteration has incorporated their ideas so that they start feeling buy-in. That's when they feel like, I get that I couldn't have everything, but I see that you listened to me and I got some or most of what I needed in this project.
Yeah. No, very cool. Yeah, seeing that how their input is being used. That's probably that's a to some degree that's what everyone wants, right? Is to feel heard and that their voice mattered in a process like that. Yeah. So I'm curious, are there like design elements or I don't know if it like I know people love to throw around like the term road diet, but also like I know I've seen like bulbs curbs, or I think I read an article about how I think you guys implemented a bike lane protected by parking. But are there design elements like that you've had to engage the public around to get buy-in around, hey, this is the way to create safety maybe that's different or new or we haven't used before in the city?
Absolutely. We are a built out urban environment. A
Mm-hmm.
road diet is basically everything we do,
Yeah.
which, just in case somebody hasn't heard the term road diet, means that maybe you have 4 lanes of traffic, but now you're looking, at your whole parkway, the trees, the curb to curb, and you're like, I want to fit more in here besides just cars. And so something has to give, and you frequently reduce the number of traffic lanes when you do that. And so, not universally popular,
Yeah.
and definitely not popular with people who weren't involved in making the decisions. So I've definitely had it where we implement a change, and that's when we hear from all the commuters and all the people who are like, why did you do this? Whoever thought it would be a good idea? But often over time, it does. When we do these road diets, we're really looking at some hard data about traffic counts and what makes sense in terms of traffic flow.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I will say about our particular city council is they are not afraid to lower the speed limit or have people drive slower. And that really works in our favor because the way that you reduce accidents, there's lots of ways, but 95% of those ways involve people going more slowly.
Mm-hmm.
So when you reduce the speed at which people drive, they have more time to react. They're looking around more for each foot of distance they go. And that really is where you start getting into safety improvements.
Mm-hmm.
But people don't like to drive slowly. So there's always a little bit of a conflict. We've done a number of different types of bike lanes. In fact, we have done bike lanes we've just striped next to the drive lane. We've done bike lanes that we've protected by moving the parked cars away from the curb, so they essentially form the barrier.
Mm-hmm.
We've done bike lanes that are protected by little bollards. We've done 2-way protected bike lanes that are protected by a concrete curb. So we have a unique perspective in that we've seen a lot of different bike lanes, and we have a pretty good sense of what's going to work and what's not going to work. We installed bike lanes on one street on Dodge Avenue years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And we did those bike lanes by having it one direction with the flow of traffic on each side of the street. And we took bike lanes that were just striped and we moved the cars away from the curb and put the bike lanes between the parked cars and the curb.
Yeah.
Now, why did we do this? We already had bike lanes. Well, there are a lot of schools located along Dodge Avenue as you look north to south, including our high school. And people were not using the bike lanes because the speed of motorized vehicles on Dodge Lane was so high. I mean, it was supposed to be 35 miles per hour. It was not. People were driving really fast. Having the striped bike lane to be the buffer between the parked cars and the drive lanes meant that the drive lanes looked extra wide. And that's when people drive faster because they don't feel crowded. They feel like they have all the room in the world to go really fast. So we implemented this project. In retrospect, we should have had more public engagement around it, and it was pushed through, and not all of the people on the city council voted for it. And so once it was implemented, people who were parking on Dodge Avenue all of a sudden were right next to the people driving really fast on Dodge Avenue. And there was a lot of really unhappy people about the situation. We saw a real increase in sideswipe accidents or people getting their mirrors clipped. It was this feeling that they didn't know it was going to happen. And so we just surprised them with it. And all of a sudden, it was just a really unsafe situation as far as the residents were concerned.
Yeah.
So it was really difficult. We had a lot of hard conversations about it as a community after it was implemented. But the irony of all of it was really successful in terms of its project goals.
Yeah, exactly. Because imagine being a bicyclist facing that. Yeah, sorry.
We saw a big increase in the number of high school students biking to high school.
Yeah.
We saw a decrease in the number of accidents. People felt very, very different about it. If you were parents and your children were trying to bike. So in terms of its direct project goals, it was great, but it was hard for the community, and it actually sort of slowed down being able to do any bike projects for a while. For a couple of years, we did very little because people were so outraged about that project. But then we had another project that was in the works, and this entire time, because it was a big federally funded project, where near Northwestern University, we were implementing a big two-way protected bike lane project. And we actually got some of the bandwidth to create this two-way protected bike lane from the street, but we got some of it from Northwestern University's project or property. They were trying to solve a problem where they had bicyclists that were students that were bicycling on the sidewalks with the pedestrians who were also students, and there were a lot of conflicts. So they were a big partner. We worked with student groups. We worked with Evanston bike agencies, organizations. And so that was a hugely momentous project that was off in a different discussion area than the Dodge Avenue project. And ultimately, that project did get built, and it was our first two-way protected bike lane. It was the gold standard of bike lane projects, with traffic signals dedicated to bike lanes. We changed how bus drop-offs worked, how pedestrians had space, and we really channeled every single user of the street into a separate lane with separate signals.
Oh, wow.
It was amazing, and it changed everything in our community about bike lanes, because after that, and especially as that operated year after year, and people who are not Northwestern students also use these bike lanes. Evanston is slightly larger than a postage stamp, so pretty much everybody goes everywhere in Evanston. And it was really beloved by the community. People just really thought it was amazing. So then, after that had been in place a few years, and we started up talking about bike lane projects and starting up new concept plans, the community started asking for two-way protected bike lanes. Interesting. That has really been a game changer.
Yeah.
One of the things we've learned by all these different bike lanes is bike lanes can be really hard to maintain. You still have to remove leaves and street sweep, and you have to remove snow. Even in the winter, people do bike.
Yeah.
So that can be really difficult. Our standard equipment does not fit into a one-way bike lane. It's just not wide enough. Mm-hmm. However, a two-way protected bike lane is very different. A pickup truck can drive down a two-way protected bike lane. And so all of a sudden, it's just a game changer in how you maintain them as well. So it's not perfect. There are challenges related still to snow removal for the main street next to it. You can't just push it off to the sides because on one side there's a bike lane. But our maintenance staff has been really engaged in trying to figure out solutions. I can't say that our engineering staff was always good at identifying the challenges up front, but we definitely heard about it on the back end. And over time, the maintenance staff has really worked to solve all of those things. So one of our takeaways, having done many of these, is first, the design vehicle as an engineer that you're looking for is not a bicycle, but is actually whatever piece of maintenance equipment you are trying to
Yeah.
fit down that bike lane. And two-way protected bike lanes really do work very, very well compared to the other types in terms of maintenance and also how they operate and how safe people feel when they're actually using them. So
Yeah.
we're skewing now towards putting in two-way protected bike lanes as
Oh,
we move forward.
that's fascinating. Yeah. Well, I love that example. Like the lesson learned around can the maintenance equipment fit is a great lesson learned. I love that. But also like the exposure to this new concept for the community. And like they probably may have been wary before, but now they get to see it in action, and now they're demanding it. That's an amazing kind of, I would say, success story. That's really cool.
It's been really surprising.
Yeah.
And then I would say the other takeaway that we've learned both from Dodge Avenue, but from all of our projects is when you start putting in bike lanes, you almost always, because of this whole road diet concept and we don't have that much extra space, you're always narrowing the drive lanes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel as great as a driver, but it does slow people down. And so bike lanes almost always really improve the number of accidents because people just drive more slowly.
Yeah. Well, and that actually ties to another question I wanted to ask you about is, I think I saw that you guys the city has also passed ordinances around reducing speed limits, but there are these design elements that help do that naturally. So, are there other things that you guys have pursued to kind of with that mind on safety and bringing down kind of both pedestrian but also vehicle crashes and accidents? Are there other things besides other things that you guys have done, initiatives or changes to codes that with an eye towards those things?
Yes, we've had with all these plans, and most recently we adopted a climate action resilience plan that it does include transportation guidelines and goals related to increasing active transportation and decreasing the number of vehicle miles driven in Evanston with motorized vehicles. So we have been really looking at how to strengthen our pedestrian network as well. And with that, we're looking more at sidewalks. We're looking at how to improve sidewalks, and we're looking at crosswalks a lot. So more frequently, crosswalks have become a really big issue. Our city council actually last year approved some changes in our crosswalk policies so that when we install crosswalks, we're looking at using a lot more infrastructure now.
Oh, interesting.
Where we do the curb extension, so we bump out the sidewalk so pedestrians have a shorter distance to walk. That can be fairly pricey money-wise because often you're impacting drainage, you're pouring concrete curbs, but it creates a little bit of a visual barrier where the road all of a sudden narrows. And so people do tend to automatically slow down when they see something like that. Similarly, we also now are putting in-street signs that say stop for pedestrian in the middle of the street. You can totally drive in the driving lane and not hit this sign. But again, because it's there and it's a little bit of an in-street barrier, drivers are slowing down to make sure they don't hit that sign with their car. And that also is working to slow people down. And then we're looking at having like a push button where you can cause the stop for pedestrian sign on the sides they have an LED border and they can flash when somebody pushes a button so cars can see that people are crossing the street. That works really well in sort of that early morning or end of day time period where it's not daytime and it's not nighttime, but it's that in-between period where pedestrians start to blend into the background and you don't have quite the same visibility. So we are looking at things like that to try to improve safety for all the users. And again, when you minimize the conflicts between pedestrians and drivers, you're slowing people down. You're really improving everybody's safety. It works better for everybody.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary or takeaway is that reducing those conflicts makes it safer for everyone, even if that means, and especially if that means drivers slow down. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, there was I know as we were kind of getting ready to record, you mentioned a couple other projects that you have in the works that, you mentioned, can you talk a little about the Chicago Avenue and Church Street projects that you guys have planned? I don't know if there's highlights or maybe they tie into some of the examples you've already given around some of the work y'all are doing, but what are those projects that can you tell our listeners about those?
Sure. So one of the things as we really focus on, like, where do we need to work, which part of the network are we working on next for bike lanes? We talk a lot about how children get to school safely. And that's similar with our pedestrian efforts too. We're really focused on that demographic because a lot of parents drive their kids to school.
Yeah.
Busing is not what it once was. And that is actually a huge cost for the school district. But many of our schools are intended to be neighborhood schools. But there's been a change over the last 4 or 5 decades where there's less kids walking to school and more parents dropping their kids off. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to look at how do we get back to making it safe enough for kids to walk to school, for kids to bike to school. So on Church Street, which is an east-west street through Evanston, quite a lot of it already has a one-way bike lane, which is, it's not one way all the way. About half of it is a one-way street. And so we have a pair of streets, Church Street and Davis Street, and Davis Street's one way the other way. So Church Street, it turns out, is where the high school is located. So we have this one-way bike lane. In some places it's protected, in some places not. But west of the high school to the city limits, we do not have that bike lane. And we do have children coming from that direction. So we are looking at implementing a bike lane for that last stretch of Church Street. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is that we started this project after Sheridan Road. So when we asked the community, what would you like to see? They went right to two-way protected bike lanes. So we're in the process of trying to wrap up the planning phase of that. So we should be having one more community meeting coming up in the not too distant future. And then we'll be finalizing our project design report and getting that to Illinois Department of Transportation for approval so we can move forward with the design and construction. So we're several years out, but we have already received some grants for that. So it's looking pretty promising in terms of getting implemented. We're really excited about it because that will be one of our first, in fact, maybe our first all the way east to west bike lane projects through the city. So again, looking at those gaps, really trying to address them. And so that's pretty cool. We've been fortunate. We've been working with, we have 2 local school districts, one for the elementary school, District 65, and one for the high school. And we've been working pretty closely with both of those school districts. And they've been really great stakeholders in trying to figure out what's going to work best and really coming to the table to discuss it. Yeah. So it's pretty exciting.
That's awesome. I love that.
The second one we have in the planning phase right now is Chicago Avenue. So that Sheridan Road bike lane that I talked about, basically Chicago Avenue feeds into Sheridan Road. That Sheridan Road, Chicago Avenue is the entire north to south connection from Wilmette north of us down to Chicago. And the Sheridan Road project made bike lanes on about half of that distance. So now we're looking at doing the other half as a 2-way protected bike lane. And again, went to the community and said, okay, we're looking at bike lanes. What do we think was going to work here? And people went to the 2-way protected bike lane again.
Yeah.
There's a lot of businesses along Chicago Avenue. So that one is actually much more challenging. And it's bordered on one side for most of the distance by the CTA Railroad tracks, which is our a local mass transit train system. So that has created its own challenges.
Yeah.
And we are still working on funding for that project, but it has been really exciting seeing all the community support for that one as well. That one is really going to be important for the region because the city of Chicago actually ends their bike network, one of their key nodes, at Chicago Avenue at the border with Evanston. And Wilmette similarly already has bike lanes on Sheridan Road north of Evanston. So that's creating a regional connection that we're really excited about.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah. Make a huge link in that regional network. That's very cool. Well, awesome. Well, I think you might have touched on this already, but I always love asking questions like this. So, but it's cool that you have a team that's already kind of cross-functional in this way. But I'm curious, as you're working on some of these projects or, thinking through maybe even the planning phases for some of these, how do you, or do you engage, other departments like community development or parks and recreation? And I think you touched on parks earlier. So I'm curious if it sounds like maybe you are doing this. So I'm curious how you approach that.
I will say economic development when we're in business districts is really critical. And
Yeah.
they have been really helpful. They actually recently did their own report about supporting business district called Evanston Thrives, and they identified a number of challenges that are transportation related in business districts. So we worked with them on that, and they work with us on our individual projects, and just it's really helpful to see that different perspective, but it's also really helpful because they have the connections to bring the right people to the table as we go forward with community. Parking, our parking group is really critical. On every project, we're always trying to make sure that we're not going to surprise them with anything when we get to construction. They similarly know the demands. We do official consultant-led parking surveys to make sure we understand how parking is used, but those are a snapshot in time. And often a resident or a business will say, hey, you looked at that, but you didn't look at it in this month, or you didn't look at it at this time of day. And that's where our parking group often will then do spot surveys, or if they are curious, they'll do a spot survey just to back up the data that the consultants provided. So it's really helpful as they help identify the actual uses and what the real challenges are to parking. Community development, they have planners that are really looking at our business districts, but also our residential areas and how we need to approach multimodal transportation to do the best support for the different types of buildings in those spaces. So frequently we enlist a planner to be on our selection committee for the consultant. We ask them to be on the stakeholder group to give us that feedback, make sure that everything we're doing seems pretty logical. Usually they have at least one person who's called the transportation and mobility coordinator. That position happens to be vacant at the moment, so other planners are covering that function, but that person is usually pretty integral to our advisory committee as well, and making sure that we're linking in some of our bicycle and pedestrian community groups, that they're being brought to the table so they can give their feedback on what's needed. And our city manager's office, which also includes the Office of Sustainability, also very helpful in terms of making sure that what we're doing, again, is linked in above to the city council, the mayor, but providing that feedback and keeping the city manager informed as they also attend meetings. So we try on the big projects, especially, we try to get a pretty broad swath of people to make sure that we've got a robust team providing feedback.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're hearing from all of those perspectives and stakeholders. Very, very cool. Awesome. Well, great. Well, I think we've already talked about some things that are coming up next that are, our listeners can stay tuned for your team's work. So our traditional last question on the podcast is always the hardest, is if you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
You can't go wrong with Queen, so I'm going to say Bicycle Race by Queen.
Bicycle, awesome. Well, that's perfect. Our producer will get that queued up. I love that pick. So With that ends our episode for today. Lara, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate you sharing kind of the great work that y'all are doing and all your experience and expertise. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you also for hosting this podcast. I feel like local government is one of those things that could be seen as incredibly dull, but I think that when you delve into it, you get to some really interesting stories.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I mean, subscribe to the podcast. Yeah, exactly. That's all we do. I think is interesting stories. So that's awesome. Well said. And to our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can also reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove, or like I said at the top of the episode, you can give us a follow on LinkedIn. We've got a GovLove podcast page now, so you'll never miss a new episode. You can also subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. And if you're already subscribed, go tell a friend, a colleague, a neighbor, your enemies about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. With that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government. On your marks, get set, go!